The auctioneer's hammer had never fallen on anything quite like this, and every soul in Redemption Creek, Texas, knew at the moment Cole Hadley stood up from his chair and said he was betting everything he owned on a woman who had already made 3 men weep and 2 more swear off the county entirely. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek sat in the hill country of Texas like a dusty jewel that had lost most of its shine. The cattle drive still pushed through twice a year, and the railroad men kept promising a line that never quite arrived. The saloon was called the Gilded Spur, and it was the kind of establishment where a man could lose his hat, his horse, and his dignity in a single evening if he was not careful. The church sat at the opposite end of Main Street, and the Reverend Dawes liked to say the two buildings were in constant spiritual warfare, which most people considered a fair assessment. Cole Hadley was 28 years old, broad in the shoulder, quiet in the way that comes not from shyness but from a man who has spent too many years talking only to cattle and open sky. He ran a modest spread called the Half Moon Ranch, which sat 6 miles east of town on land that had cost him 4 years of driving other men's herds up to Kansas. He had a good barn, a solid house he had built with his own hands, 40 head of cattle, a string of 7 horses that were among the finest in the county, and enough corn in the ground to carry him through winter. He was, by the measured standards of 1878 Texas, a man of reasonable standing. He had never been much for auctions. The auction in question was not the kind a man walked away from with a pig or a new plow. It was a land auction, called by the county commissioner after old Silas Vance died intestate and left behind 240 acres of prime bottomland along the creek, along with a debt to the bank in San Antonio that needed settling. The auction would clear the debt and transfer the land, and every rancher within 40 miles had ridden in with money folded into their breast pockets and hope folded into their expressions. Cole had ridden in with his savings, $420 in a leather pouch, and a simple plan to bid on the North 40 of the Vance land, which bordered his own pasture and would give his cattle access to the creek in the dry months. It was a good plan. It was a sensible plan. He had not planned on Maura Vance. He saw her first from across the street, standing outside the land office with her arms crossed and her chin tilted upward in the particular way of a person who is furious, but has decided that fury alone will not be sufficient. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up imperfectly, and a green dress that had been let out at the seams recently, and she was arguing with Commissioner Gerald Holt in a voice that carried clean down the block. "This land was my father's," she was saying, and her voice had that quality of controlled thunder that made men step back without fully knowing why. "He may not have left a will, but he left a daughter, and I have lived on that land for 24 years and worked it with my own hands, and you cannot simply auction it out from under me because of a bank debt he ran up without my knowledge." Commissioner Holt, who was a round man with a red face and the particular look of someone who had made a decision and was uncomfortable with it, tugged at his collar. "Miss Vance, the law is quite clear. Without a will and without the funds to satisfy the debt, the land must." "The law," Maura Vance said, cutting him off with a precision that made the 2 men standing nearby flinch, "was written by men who never once considered what a woman in my position might be owed. That does not make it right. That makes it convenient." Cole stopped walking entirely. He had heard of Maura Vance, of course. Everyone in Redemption Creek had. She was the daughter of Silas Vance, who had been a fair man and a decent rancher, and she had kept his operation running for the past 2 years while he declined from the lung sickness that eventually took him in March. The town said she was difficult. The town said she had a tongue like a branding iron and opinions she did not trouble herself to keep private. The widow Pearson said she was unmanageable. The men at the feed store said she thought too highly of herself. The ladies at the church auxiliary said she had never once attended a social without starting an argument. Cole, standing in the dust of Main Street watching her hold her ground against a commissioner and 2 deputies, thought the town might have been describing the wrong quality entirely. What he was seeing did not look like difficulty. It looked like a woman who was entirely right and knew it, fighting against a system that had already decided to ignore her. He found out the rest of the story from his friend Walt Briggs, who was standing near the water trough and watching the proceedings with the satisfied expression of a man who has brought popcorn to a theatrical performance. Silas Vance had borrowed heavily from the San Antonio bank 2 years ago, telling no one, using the land as collateral. When he died, the debt came due immediately. It totaled $380, more money than Maura had on hand, which was precisely $46 and some change, every penny of which she had earned herself selling eggs and garden produce. The auction was set for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Whatever the land fetched would go first to the bank, and whatever remained, if anything, would technically be hers. But the way the bidding was likely to go, with 3 major ranchers attending, the land would sell for considerably more than the debt, and the surplus would go into county escrow for 2 years before she could claim it, by which point she would have nowhere to live and no means of operating the property she had worked all her life. "She's been trying to stop it all morning," Walt said, shaking his head. "Went to the bank, went to the commissioner, wrote a letter to the circuit judge. Man isn't due in the county for 6 weeks. Is anyone helping her?" Cole asked. Walt looked at him. "Son, this town has called that woman difficult since she was 16 years old and told Reverend Dawes his sermon was factually incorrect. Nobody in Redemption Creek is losing sleep over Maura Vance's troubles." Cole watched her for another long moment. The commissioner had turned away, the conversation clearly concluded in his favor. Maura stood with her arms still crossed, watching Holtz retreating back with an expression that contained about 7 different kinds of hard feeling. Then she turned and walked in the other direction, and her chin was still up, and her jaw was set, and if she was going to cry, she was certainly not going to do it on Main Street. Cole put his hand on the leather pouch in his pocket and did some arithmetic that he knew, even as he did it, was not really about numbers. The auction began at 2 o'clock in front of the land office, under a sun that had been cooking the hill country since May and showed no signs of relenting. There were perhaps 30 people gathered, including the 3 major bidders. Douglas Crane, who ran the largest spread in the county and wanted the bottomland for his growing herd. Hector Prout, who was a speculator from San Antonio and wanted the land because he believed the railroad would eventually come through it. And Ben Alcott, who was Crane's neighbor and Crane's rival, and bidded on anything Crane wanted out of pure competitive spirit. Maura Vance stood at the edge of the crowd. She had come to watch, because watching was the only thing left available to her. Cole noticed that no one was standing near her, not from malice exactly. More from that particular social cowardice that makes people avoid the proximity of someone else's misfortune. He walked through the crowd and stood beside her. She looked at him with the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who has learned to read strangers quickly and trust them slowly. "I do not require company," she said. "I know it," he said. "Then why are you standing there?" "Because the sun is better on this side of the crowd." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she looked back at the auctioneer, and she did not tell him to move. The bidding started at $200. Douglas Crane opened at $220. Prout came in at $250. Alcott, true to form, jumped to $300 for no reason other than to annoy Crane. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Cole had $420. He had come to bid on the North 40 only. The North 40 was expected to sell separately, after the main parcel. Except Commissioner Holt had decided that morning, apparently, to simplify the process by selling the entire 240 acres as a single lot. Cole had not known this until he arrived and read the posted notice. He had, in the 15 minutes since reading it, adjusted his plan several times, and each adjustment had arrived at the same conclusion, which was that the conclusion was insane. Crane bid $350. Prout went to $380. $380, the exact amount of the debt. If the land sold for exactly that, the bank would be satisfied and Maura would receive nothing except the legal right to vacate the property within 30 days. Cole looked at the leather pouch in his hand. Maura was standing very still beside him. Her hands were clasped in front of her now, and her knuckles were white. Alcott pushed it to 400, glancing sideways at Crane with poorly concealed satisfaction. Crane, his face darkening, raised to 410. Cole raised his hand. $420, he said. The crowd turned. The auctioneer squinted at him. Even Crane and Prout turned to look, with the particular expression of men who have just heard something unexpected from an unexpected direction. Maura Vance turned to look at him too. Cole did not look at her. He watched the auctioneer. Crane's jaw worked. He had reached the number he had calculated as his limit before riding out this morning. He looked at Prout, and some silent negotiation of territorial pride occurred between them. "420, the auctioneer said. "Do I hear 430? The crowd was very quiet. Crane shook his head once, short and sharp. Prout looked at his hands. Alcott, who had not actually wanted the land in the first place, seemed almost relieved. $420 going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. Cole's heart was doing something undignified in his chest. Sold to Cole Hadley for $420. The hammer fell. Cole stood there for a moment, holding an empty leather pouch and the deed to 240 acres of land he had not planned to buy, listening to the blood in his ears. Maura Vance had gone very still beside him. He felt her looking at him. He turned. Her face was complicated in a way that was almost painful to witness. There was relief there, and confusion, and something that might have been gratitude fighting hard against a disposition that did not arrive at gratitude easily. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. The words were not aggressive. They were genuine, which, he would learn later, was considerably rarer from her than the aggressive kind. "I have not entirely worked that out yet," he admitted. "You have just spent everything you own on 240 acres of land. That appears to be correct. What exactly do you intend to do with it?" He looked at her steadily. "I thought perhaps I would discuss that with the woman who has been farming it for 24 years and might have some ideas." She stared at him. Around them the crowd was dispersing, some people talking, some people shaking their heads, all of them generating opinions they would share later at supper. Walt Briggs was staring at Cole from across the space with an expression that combined admiration and deep concern in roughly equal measure. "You do not know me," Maura said. "No," he agreed. "The town will tell you I am difficult. The town tells me many things. I have found its reliability to be inconsistent." Something shifted in her expression, just barely. The tight line of her mouth did not exactly soften, but it changed in some small way that he noticed. "I need to get the bank draft settled," he said. "I would like to speak with you afterward if you are willing, somewhere that is not the middle of Main Street." She considered him for a long moment with those dark eyes that seemed to be conducting some interior assessment he was not privy to. Then she said, "I will be at the ranch. You know where it is." "Everyone knows where it is," he said. She nodded once and walked away, and Cole watched her go and then walked toward the land office with the hollow certainty of a man who has done something irrevocable and is not sure yet whether it was the bravest or the most foolish thing of his life. It was both, as it turned out. Most of the best things are. The bank draft took an hour to settle, during which Cole signed more papers than he had signed in the past 5 years combined, and the bank officer from San Antonio, who had ridden up specifically for the auction, looked at him with the cautious admiration one reserves for people who do dramatic things with their money. Cole rode out to the Vance ranch in the middle of the afternoon, when the heat was at its worst, and the cattle stood in whatever shade the live oaks provided with expressions of profound philosophical resignation. The Vance property was, he saw immediately, a well-run place. The fences were in good repair. The garden behind the house was substantial and tended carefully. The barn was clean and organized in the way that speaks of someone who works not out of obligation but out of genuine care. The house itself was modest but sound, with a covered porch that faced west to catch the evening breeze. Maura was in the garden when he rode up, and she came to the gate and met him without the expression of someone who has been waiting anxiously. She had changed out of the green dress into a plain work dress of deep blue cotton, and her hair was still imperfectly pinned, and there was a streak of garden soil on her forearm that she had not bothered to clean. "You should come inside," she said. "I made coffee." The inside of the house was comfortable and particular. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, actual books, not just almanacs, but novels and a history of the Roman Republic, and a worn copy of the complete works of Shakespeare that had been read until the spine was soft. There was a braided rug on the floor and curtains at the window that had been hemmed with care. On the mantelpiece there was a small painted portrait of a woman who had Maura's jaw in her eyes, who Cole took to be her mother. He sat at the kitchen table and she poured coffee from a blue enamel pot and sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I have a proposal," he said. "I want to say it plainly so there is no confusion." "I appreciate plainness," she said. "The Vance land borders my north pasture. Combined with my existing spread, it would make one of the best positioned ranches in this part of the county, with year-round creek access and enough bottomland to grow feed through the dry season. It is genuinely good land, and whoever works it knows what they are doing." She said nothing, just watched him with those assessing eyes. "I cannot farm two properties simultaneously from 6 miles apart. And I understand that this land is your home, and that you have knowledge of it that I do not have and would take years to acquire. I am proposing a partnership arrangement, a proper legal one, drawn up by the lawyer in town. You continue to operate this property. I provide the capital for seed, materials, and stock. We split the profits equitably. You retain your home." Maura set her coffee cup down. "A partnership," she said. "Yes. You would trust a woman you met this morning to be your business partner." "I would trust a woman who kept this operation running while her father was dying for 2 years, and who arrived at the auction this morning with every legal argument available to her already organized and ready to deploy. That is not a question of trust. That is a recognition of demonstrated competence." Maura looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. "The town will talk," she said. "The town talks already. I've never found it helpful to make my decisions based on what the town intends to say about them. It will affect you. A single man in a business arrangement with a single woman, people will say things. People will always say things," he said. "The question is whether the arrangement itself is honorable, and I believe it is. I want to be clear that I intend nothing beyond what I have stated. I'm not trying to maneuver you into an obligation you did not choose." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a mockingbird was doing its theatrical repertoire from somewhere in the oak tree near the barn. "I want it in writing," she said finally. "Everything. Terms, profit split, duration, what happens if either of us wishes to dissolve it." "Absolutely," he said, "and I want it witnessed by someone who is not your friend." "I would suggest it," he agreed. She looked at him again with that particular careful attention, and then she did something he had not expected from the woman the town called difficult. She almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was more like the idea of a smile, visiting briefly before she thought better of it. But it changed her face in a way that was remarkable, and Cole Hadley, who had lived 28 years without losing his head over a woman, felt something shift in his chest that he recognized, with some alarm, as the beginning of serious trouble. "All right," she said. "We will go to the lawyer tomorrow." They went to Ezra Phelps, the town lawyer, who was 60 years old and had practiced in Redemption Creek for 30 years and had seen nearly everything, but admitted afterward to his wife that he had not quite seen this. The partnership agreement was drawn up over the course of 3 hours, with Maura asking questions and requesting modifications that impressed Phelps sufficiently that he told his wife that evening. She was sharper than half the businessmen he had dealt with in his career. The document was signed, witnessed by Phelps himself and by his secretary, and Maura received a copy and Cole received a copy, and both of them walked out of the lawyer's office into the afternoon sun with something new and somewhat bewildering in the air between them. They rode back toward the Vance property together, because Cole wanted to walk the fence line and understand what he had purchased, and Maura had offered to show him, because she knew every post and wire of it. They rode for 2 hours, and she talked about the land with a directness and affection that he found quietly astonishing. She knew the creek level at different seasons. She knew which sections of pasture went boggy in winter and which stayed dry. She knew that the big live oak in the southwest corner had a beehive in the 3rd branch, and that the honey it produced was exceptional. And she knew which neighbors' cattle had a tendency to breach the fence in early spring, and which ones you could go to directly, and which ones you needed to bring the sheriff to before they would act. Cole asked questions and listened to the answers. He did not pretend to know things he did not know. He did not give her advice she had not requested. He simply listened, and at some point Maura noticed this and became slightly more at ease, her sentences coming a little more freely, her descriptions gaining detail. "You are not what I expected," she said at one point when they had stopped to water the horses at the creek. "What did you expect? Someone trying to negotiate me into a corner, someone who would be pleasant about it." She paused. "The men who have tried to help me before, and there have not been many, always wanted something that was not in the agreement." Cole looked at the creek. "I will not pretend I bought that land entirely out of altruism," he said carefully. "It is good land and a good business investment, but I will tell you plainly that I do not intend to use the investment as leverage for anything else. That is not who I am." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. "I believe you," she said, and from the way she said it, he understood that those 3 words cost her something. They spent the rest of that afternoon walking the eastern pasture, and Cole's horse, a gray named Colonel, took an immediate liking to Maura's bay mare and kept crowding close, which made Maura laugh, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, that startled both of them. She put her hand to her mouth almost immediately after, as if she had not intended to let that out, and Cole felt an absolute ache of warmth for her that he was not prepared for and had nowhere to put. He rode back to his own ranch that evening and sat on his porch in the dark and thought about the business arrangement and the fence line and the beehive and the live oak and the way she had said, "I believe you," and he knew that he was in considerable difficulty of a very specific kind. The weeks that followed were full of work, which helped keep the more complicated feelings at bay. There was mending to be done on the creekside fence, which involved 4 long days of digging and wire stringing. Cole did most of the heavy work and Maura directed and participated with a pragmatic energy that he found both impressive and, if he was honest with himself, somewhat breathtaking. She was not the kind of woman who stood back and supervised. She dug fence posts. She drove nails. She was stronger than she looked and considerably more practical than most people he had worked alongside, and she had no patience for doing things the second best way when the best way was available. Their arrangement drew exactly the kind of town commentary that Maura had predicted. The widow Pearson told anyone who would listen that it was irregular and probably immoral. The men at the feed store had various opinions, none of which were asked for. Reverend Dawes preached a sermon that was technically about the Book of Ruth, but which was understood by everyone present to be about Maura Vance and Cole Hadley, and which managed to be simultaneously disapproving of the arrangement and approving of its productivity, which made the sermon confusing and the congregation slightly dizzy. Cole went to the feed store and the post office and the Saturday market, and said nothing about it to anyone, which drove the town to considerably greater speculation than any response could have. Maura, for her part, went where she always went and did what she always did, and continued to be exactly as direct with people as she had always been, which is to say unsparing. And several people found this newly infuriating for reasons they could not quite articulate, which was because they had expected the improved circumstances of her situation to make her more agreeable, and they were disappointed to find that it had not. Cole and Maura met twice a week initially, at the Vance property to review the work and plan the coming tasks. These meetings were conducted at the kitchen table over coffee, and they were businesslike and efficient, and they both were careful to keep them that way, with a carefulness that had nothing to do with not caring and everything to do with caring in a direction that felt premature and possibly unreciprocated. It was Walt Briggs who first said it out loud, 4 weeks into the arrangement, when he and Cole were mending tack in the barn at the Half Moon. "You are in love with that woman," Walt said conversationally, not looking up from the bridle he was oiling. "I have a business arrangement with that woman," Cole said. "And you ride 6 miles each way to those meetings looking like a man who has just been told Christmas is coming early. Cole, I have known you since you were 19 years old and a terrible poker player, and you are still a terrible poker player." Cole was quiet for a moment. "She is remarkable," he said finally. "Everyone in this county knows she is remarkable. Half of them hate her for it. What I am asking is what you intend to do about the fact that you are very obviously in love with her." "Nothing," Cole said. "The arrangement is working. She is just beginning to trust it. I am not going to do anything to complicate that." Walt considered this. "That is either very noble or very stupid," he said. "Possibly both," Cole said. It was, in fact, an ongoing war between his better judgment and a feeling that did not particularly respect better judgment. Every time he was near her, the feeling stated its case loudly. Every time he rode away from the Vance property, judgment reasserted itself with increasing weariness. The thing that changed it was a thunderstorm. It came in October, which was early for serious weather in the hill country, riding in from the northwest on a wall of dark cloud that turned the afternoon sky the color of a bruise. Cole was at the Vance property when it hit, the two of them in the barn doing an inventory of the winter feed supply, and the storm came down with a violence that made the horses nervous, and the barn roof flex under the wind. Rain drove horizontal against the wood and lightning split the sky in long white branches, and they were clearly not going anywhere for some time. They sat on hay bales near the barn door, watching the rain sheet across the yard, and the storm was loud enough that to be heard you had to speak with some directness, which perhaps was why what happened next happened. "Can I ask you something personal?" Maura said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you bid on that land?" "At the auction, the real reason." He thought about deflecting to the business logic. It would have been easy. Some part of him recognized that they had arrived in this moment at a fork in something. "Because I was watching you," he said. "I saw you arguing with Commissioner Holt, and I thought that woman is right, and everyone is going to walk away from her anyway because being right is not enough, and I could not do that." She was quiet for a moment, the rain speaking for both of them. "That is not a business reason," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at the rain. "People have been walking away from me my whole life," she said, and her voice was very even, which he had learned meant she was saying something that cost her. "My mother died when I was 12. My father was a good man, but he retreated into himself more every year. The town made up its mind about me when I was young, and decided that a woman with opinions and without apology for them was a problem to be managed. I learned early that the only person I could count on to stay was myself. I know that story is supposed to end with, and now I do not need anyone," Cole said carefully, "but I do not think that is actually how it ends for most people." She looked at him then. Her expression was unguarded in a way he had not seen before, the careful architecture of self-sufficiency momentarily simplified by the storm and the dark and the directness they had both apparently decided to allow. "No," she said quietly. "It is not." They sat in the barn while the storm blew itself past, and they talked for 2 hours, really talked, the way people do when they stop performing their public selves and simply speak. She told him about her mother, who had been a school teacher from Virginia, and who had taught Maura to read with the fierce conviction that literacy was the one freedom no one could take away. He told her about his own family, his father who had died in the war when Cole was 13, his mother who had worked herself to exhaustion to keep 3 children clothed and fed, who had died of influenza when Cole was 20 and had left him with the conviction that a life without someone to work toward was a life without direction. "Is that why you bought the land?" she asked. "To have direction." "Partly," he said. "But I think I also bought it because I did not want to ride away from you without having done something that might keep me in your vicinity long enough to know whether what I was feeling was real or just the most expensive impulse of my life." The silence that followed was the kind that holds its breath. "Cole," she said, and his name in her mouth was different from any version of it he had heard before, quieter, more careful. "I am not saying that to pressure you into anything," he said quickly. "The arrangement stands as it is, regardless. I wanted you to know the truth of it because I think you deserve the truth, and because I am a poor liar and it was going to become apparent eventually." She looked at him for a long, serious moment, and then she did something that surprised him more than almost anything had surprised him in 28 years. She reached out and put her hand briefly over his, just for a moment, the lightest contact, and then withdrew it. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been feeling something very similar, and I have been telling myself a number of excellent reasons why it would not be practical to act on it. But I want you to know that I am aware of it." He looked at her. "That is the most cautious declaration I have ever heard." "I am a cautious person," she said, and then she almost smiled again, and this time the smile came a little further than the idea of itself. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was new, a softness underneath the capable surface of her, something that had been there all along but which she did not habitually allow to be visible. "I know," she said. "That is what I am beginning to understand." November came in cold and clear, and the work of winter preparation drove them into more sustained proximity. Cole brought 2 of his horses to the Vance barn, which was larger, for the coldest months, and this gave him daily reason to come by and daily evidence that Maura Vance was the kind of person you could be around every day without ever running out of things to discover. She could cook with remarkable skill, which she treated as a purely practical matter. She had opinions about weather that turned out to be astonishingly accurate, better than the almanac. She read at night by candlelight and would sometimes look up from a book with an expression of such concentrated interior pleasure that Cole had to look away. She was strict with herself in a way that had clearly been survival once and was habit now, and she was working. He could see it, carefully, like watching a flower open in cold weather on the practice of allowing someone else to be reliable. He did not push. He simply showed up, consistently, every day that their arrangement brought him to the property, and sometimes on days it did not, with a plausible excuse about the horses or the fence line or a question about the spring planting plan. She never mentioned that the excuse was transparent. He thought she probably appreciated the restraint. The first time he held her hand on purpose was in December, walking the creek line to check for erosion after a heavy rain. They were picking their way along the bank, which was slippery, and he put his hand out to steady her on a difficult section, and she took it, and then the difficult section was passed, and neither of them let go. They walked for 20 minutes like that, talking about creek levels and winter pasture, holding hands with the careful normalcy of people who have agreed without speaking to make a change. When they got back to the house, she made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and the sitting was different now, slightly closer. The air between them changed in quality. "I have been thinking," she said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "About anything specific?" he asked. "About the fact that I have spent a long time being defined by what I am not. I am not agreeable. I am not quiet. I am not easy. And I have defended those things because they were true and because people were wrong to use them against me." She paused. "But I think I have also sometimes used them as a wall, because a wall keeps things out and things that stay out cannot leave." Cole set his coffee cup down very carefully. "Maura, I am not finished," she said, in the tone she used when she was going to finish a thought regardless. "Of course," he said. "I want to say that I am not afraid of you." That is what I am working toward. I have been afraid of a lot of people in the sense of what they would do with access to the parts of me that are not defended, and I find that I am not afraid of you in that way. I do not know exactly what to do with that yet, but I wanted to say it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I think you might be the bravest person I have ever known." She looked almost startled, and then something in her face settled like a held breath released. "People do not usually say that." "People have been looking at the surface," he said. "I have been paying attention to what is underneath." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she reached across the table and took his hand, and this time it was deliberate, and it was her doing the reaching, and that mattered enormously to both of them. He stayed for supper that evening. They cooked together in the small kitchen, working around each other in the comfortable negotiation of two people who are learning each other's rhythms, and they ate at the kitchen table by candlelight and talked until the candles burned low. When he finally rode home through the cold December dark, he was smiling in the particular helpless way of a man who has accepted that there is nothing he can do about what has happened to him. By January, they were no longer pretending that the morning rides and the kitchen table conversations and the walking of fence lines were only about the business arrangement. And by February, the town of Redemption Creek had fully updated its opinions, which it expressed with a vigor and detail that suggested it had not been this entertained in some years. The widow Pearson said it was a scandal. Walt Briggs said it was about time. Reverend Dawes said something carefully ambiguous from the pulpit that covered all possibilities. Douglas Crane, who had been outbid at the auction, watched the whole development with the sour expression of a man who suspects he has lost something more interesting than land. Commissioner Holt had the grace to look, once, in the vicinity of sheepish. Maura received all of this with the composure of a woman who has been the subject of town commentary her entire life, and has learned to regard it as weather, something to be noted, and then proceeded through. Cole noticed that she had stopped, subtly, shielding herself from him. She no longer manufactured excuses to be at the far end of the property when he arrived. She no longer carefully withdrew from any conversation that ran the risk of becoming personal. She made coffee when she heard his horse in the yard and left the door on the latch. He kissed her for the first time in February, which in the hill country was sometimes still cold and sometimes already spring, and that year it was both in the same week. They had been standing on her porch watching a late winter sunset, the sky turning extraordinary shades of orange and rose over the distant hills, and she had said something about the way the light hit the creek in winter being different from any other season. And he had turned to look at her instead of the sunset, and she had turned and found him looking, and neither of them had done anything for a moment except acknowledge, without words, what was about to happen. The kiss was brief and careful, and then she put her forehead against his shoulder for just a moment, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there on the porch while the sunset finished its work, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. What needed saying came later, over several weeks, in the slow and particular language of two people who have both been hurt and careful, and who are now, against their better judgment, choosing to be unhurt and careless in the very best sense of that word. She told him about a man who had courted her when she was 20, who had been charming and who had wanted the land, and who had said things about her to his friends that she had eventually heard repeated back, and which had made her understand that what she had taken for genuine feeling had been a kind of performance. She said this plainly, without self-pity, as a piece of information she wanted him to have. He told her about the years after his mother died, driving other men's cattle and sleeping under open sky, and beginning to believe that the life he was building was going to be built alone, not from choice, but from the absence of the right person. He said this without drama, as a thing that was simply true and was now, evidently, no longer true. They talked about the business arrangement, which was thriving in ways that surprised both of them. The combined knowledge and resources had produced a winter that was significantly more productive than either property had managed alone. Maura had ideas about expanding the garden into a proper market operation. Vegetables and herbs sold to the mercantile and to the hotel in town. That were, Cole had to admit, excellent ideas. He had contacts with the cattle buyers in San Antonio from his driving years that opened markets for the stock. By March, a year had not yet passed since the auction, and they were already running what most people in the county would have called a real operation. And they were doing it together, which was a thing that the town, watching and commenting, gradually and with some reluctance began to admit was working. Spring came again, and with it the question that had been present since February, growing more present with each passing week. Cole asked her on an evening in April, when the bluebonnets had come up along the creek and the air smelled of new grass and cedar. They had eaten supper and walked down to the creek afterward, which had become a habit, and the water was running clear and bright in the last light, and he stopped walking and she stopped with him and looked at him with the expression that meant she was paying complete attention. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to say before I ask it that I am not asking because of the land or the arrangement or any of the practical things. I am asking because every morning when I wake up, the first thing I think of is you, and every problem I want to solve with you, and every good thing I see I want to show you. I have been in love with you since the afternoon I watched you argue with Commissioner Holt about justice, and I have been working up to this since the evening of the thunderstorm, and I am done working up to it." Maura looked at him with steady dark eyes and said nothing yet, but the look was not the look of a woman who is about to refuse. "Will you marry me?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment and the creek spoke for her, and then she said, "Yes." Not with the explosive relief of someone who has been waiting to say it, with the quiet certainty of someone who has considered the matter thoroughly and arrived at the answer by honest means. "Yes," she said again, and this time she was smiling, a real full smile that he had seen building for months now and that still struck him like a physical thing. "I will marry you, Cole Hadley." He took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about how she felt, and the creek ran bright beside them and the bluebonnets covered the bank, and above them the first stars were appearing in the Texas sky. They told Walt first, because Walt deserved to know first, on the grounds that he had told Cole he was in love before Cole had fully admitted it to himself, and therefore earned the privilege. Walt was inordinately pleased and shook Cole's hand and then, unexpectedly, hugged Maura, who bore it with tolerant grace. "I knew it," Walt said, "from the moment you stood next to her at that auction." "You did not know anything," Cole said. "I knew everything," Walt said. "I simply lacked confirmation." Ezra Phelps, when informed, said that he would like to draft a formal property agreement for the marriage as well, because the partnership agreement predated the engagement and certain arrangements needed to be updated to reflect the changed situation. Cole said that was entirely reasonable. Maura said she would like to look over every line before signing. Phelps said he expected nothing less. The Reverend Dawes, when Cole called on him the next morning, managed a reaction that was mostly gracious and only slightly complicated. He had preached one ambiguous sermon and two clear ones about the irregularity of the situation, and he now found himself marrying the parties in question, which required a brief philosophical adjustment. Cole gave him the time to make it and thanked him sincerely, and the Reverend ended up being genuinely moved by the conviction both parties brought to the proceedings. The wedding was in May, on a Saturday, with the church full because the wedding of Cole Hadley and Maura Vance was an event of genuine communal interest, and there was not a person in Redemption Creek who was going to miss it regardless of their opinion on the matter. Walt stood with Cole. Maura had no family to stand with her, a fact that was briefly, privately painful, but she had asked old Ezra Phelps to walk her to the front of the church. which he did with such genuine dignity and warmth that several people cried, including the widow Pearson, who would have vehemently denied it. The vows were the traditional ones, but when they exchanged them in the particular voice each of them used for things that mattered, her voice steady and clear, his low and certain, they sounded new. Reverend Dawes said, and he later admitted he had not planned to say it, that he believed he was witnessing two people who genuinely understood what they were promising, and he was glad to be in the room. Afterward there was a celebration at the Gilded Spur, which the owner had generously opened for the occasion, and someone played fiddle and someone played guitar, and Cole danced with Maura until she laughed at his footwork, and then she taught him the steps she knew and they were both laughing, and Walt Briggs watched from a corner with a whiskey and an expression of complete satisfaction. The summer they were married was the best working summer the combined ranch had yet seen. The garden expansion succeeded beyond what even Maura had projected, and the mercantile in town and the hotel both took regular orders. The cattle did well on the creekside pasture. Cole's horses, which Maura had taken a detailed interest in, were being bought by ranchers from 3 counties over, because she had opinions about breeding and training that turned out to be, as her opinions generally turned out to be, correct. They worked alongside each other every day, and the work was different from any work Cole had done before, because there was someone to discuss it with and plan it with and complain about it with and take satisfaction in it with. And the taking of satisfaction together is a thing that multiplies the satisfaction in ways that solo ownership cannot replicate. In the evenings they sat on the porch, Maura's porch, the westward-facing one that caught the evening breeze, and talked, or read, or simply sat in the comfortable silence that develops between people who have learned each other's company thoroughly enough that silence becomes a kind of conversation. She still had opinions that she did not keep private. She still had a tongue that moved faster than diplomacy could manage, and she still argued with Commissioner Holt on civic matters and was still, by most accounts, difficult in the sense of not making things easy for people who were wrong. Cole found this, consistently, admirable. He told her so, and she looked at him the first time he said it with the expression of someone hearing something so unfamiliar they are checking whether they have misunderstood. Most people find it exhausting, she said. Most people find accountability exhausting, he said. That says something about those people. She looked at him for a moment, and then she leaned over and kissed him on the side of the face with an affection that was quiet and sincere, and went back to whatever she was reading. She was, he thought, still learning to be loved without bracing for the condition to be withdrawn. And he was, if he was honest, still learning to let himself have something good without cataloging all the ways it might be taken away. They were doing that learning together, which made it the best possible classroom. In the autumn of their first married year, Maura told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, over the morning coffee, in the direct way she delivered all important information, and his reaction was, she told him afterward, so immediate and unguarded that she could not possibly have doubted how he felt about it. He had stood up from the table and crossed to her and gathered her up in a way that she initially protested. She was not, she said, fragile, and she did not require being gathered up on the basis of this particular news. But then she had put her arms around him and held on, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Are you happy?" he asked into her hair. "I am terrified," she said. "I am also very happy, both at the same time." "That seems right," he said. "I do not know the first thing about being a mother," she said. "My own mother died when I was 12. And I grew up with a father who was gone and a mother who died young, and here we are," he said. "We will learn together. We are good at that." She was quiet against him. Then she said, "I keep thinking I will wake up and it will all be a different year and I will still be standing in that auction crowd watching everything I had slip away." "I know," he said, "but you are not. This is real." "I know it is real," she said, in a voice that was slightly thicker than usual. "That is the part I am still getting used to." The pregnancy was not easy in the first months, because Maura was not constitutionally suited to being anything less than fully capable, and the first 4 months tested that considerably. She was sick in the mornings with a reliable misery that she bore with stoic fury, and she was tired in the afternoons, which she found personally offensive, and she continued to work at her usual pace and required Cole to have conversations about the pace on 3 separate occasions, each of which ended with her conceding the point with bad grace and resting for the afternoon, which she spent reading with pointed efficiency, as if to demonstrate that rest was a perfectly active occupation. By the 5th month she had settled into a rhythm that worked, and by the 7th she was, if anything, more organized about the operation than she had been before, having apparently channeled the energy of impending motherhood into an extremely detailed ledger system that covered every aspect of the ranch from feed costs to horse breeding timelines. "You do not have to account for everything," Cole said gently one evening, watching her update columns by candlelight. "I know," she said, not looking up. "I find it comforting." He thought about this. "Is it that you want to know everything is in order in case something?" She looked up at him then, and the look answered the question before she spoke. "I have lost people," she said. "I like to know the house is in order." He pulled his chair beside hers and sat down. "The house is in order," he said, "and you are going to be fine. And whatever happens, you are not doing any of it alone. That is a promise I can actually keep." She looked at him for a long moment with those serious dark eyes. Then she nodded once, and put her hand briefly on his, and went back to the ledger, but the set of her shoulders had changed. The baby arrived in March of 1880, when the bluebonnets were just beginning along the creek, and the air had the first tentative warmth of approaching spring. The birth was attended by the midwife, a capable and calm woman named Mrs. Dora Elliston, who had delivered most of the county's children for 15 years. Cole was relegated to the porch, which he paced for 4 hours with the focused anxiety of a man who has built a good life and is suddenly and acutely aware of how much he wants to keep it. Walt Briggs came and sat with him for the middle 2 hours, not saying much, just being present, which was the most useful thing available. When Mrs. Elliston opened the door and told him he had a son, Cole stood very still for a moment and then said thank you in a voice that was not entirely steady. The boy was born healthy and loud and entirely himself from the first moment. They named him James, after Cole's father, with Sela's as a middle name, after Maura's. Maura looked at the baby in the particular way of someone who has walked through something terrifying and arrived at the other side of it and is counting the gifts. "Hello, James Silas Hadley," she said softly. "I have been worried about you for 7 months, and now here you are, and I intend to continue worrying about you for the foreseeable future, because that is apparently what I do." Cole sat beside her on the bed and put his arm around her, and they both looked at the baby, who was looking at the ceiling with the profound concentration of someone who has recently arrived and is still taking inventory. "He looks like he has opinions," Cole said. "Good," Maura said. "He should." James grew the way healthy babies grew in that era, with the combination of robust appetite and surprising rapidity that makes parents feel time is moving at a different speed than it normally does. Maura nursed him and held him and talked to him with the same directness she brought to everything, and he was, by all accounts, an exceptionally alert baby who watched his mother with steady dark eyes that were going to be exactly hers. Cole had never in his life imagined fatherhood with any concreteness, the way you do not quite imagine a thing you are not sure you will have, but the reality of it was an ongoing revelation. The weight of the boy in his arms in the evening. The particular way James grabbed his finger with a grip that was entirely disproportionate to his size. The expressions that moved across the small face, like whether satisfaction, alarm, curiosity, sleep, arriving and departing with the marvelous speed of a person who has not yet learned to hide any of them. The ranch continued to thrive. The year 1880 brought a good spring and a solid cattle market, and the San Antonio connections moved product at prices that more than justified the operation's investment. Maura's market garden had become, by this point, a genuinely recognized enterprise. The hotel in town actively advertised the provenance of its produce, and there had been an inquiry from a restaurant in San Antonio that Maura was in the early stages of responding to with the systematic enthusiasm she brought to any new potential. Cole watched her manage all of it: the baby, the ranch, the correspondence with San Antonio, the ongoing civic arguments she conducted with Commissioner Holt about water rights and road conditions. And he felt, with a frequency that still surprised him, the particular species of astonishment that comes from living alongside someone exceptional. The town had, over the course of these years, updated its relationship with Maura Vance Hadley. Not entirely, and not all at once. Some people maintained their original positions with the loyalty of those who had made an assessment and intended to keep it, but others had quietly revised. The widow Pearson, having sampled the produce from Maura's market garden on 3 separate occasions and found it incomparable, had progressed from open disapproval to a wary respect that she expressed by not saying anything negative when Maura's name came up, which for the widow Pearson was essentially an endorsement. Reverend Dawes had called on them when James was born, and had been so visibly pleased by the domestic scene, he witnessed that he delivered a sermon the following Sunday about the particular grace of homes built on partnership and mutual respect, which was the most progressive thing he had said from that pulpit in 30 years. Douglas Crane had never quite forgiven the auction, but he was a pragmatic man, and when he needed advice on creekside pasture management, a subject on which the Hadley operation had become something of an authority, he swallowed his pride and came to ask. Maura had given him the information directly and without gloating, which he had found so disorienting that he had gone home and told his wife he was not sure what to make of her. His wife, who had met Maura twice and found her extraordinary, said she thought the not knowing was probably his problem rather than Maura's. The autumn of 1881 brought a dry spell that tested every rancher in the county. The creek ran low, and the pasture that would have gone brown went brown faster, and the cattle market softened at exactly the wrong moment. Cole and Maura spent 3 weeks making adjustments, selling the stock that would not hold and holding the stock that would, rationing water, bringing the garden production down to what the reduced water table could support. And by the end of those 3 weeks they were tired and somewhat strained, but had navigated the difficulty without serious damage. It was during this period that something else happened, which was that Cole discovered Maura at her desk one evening writing a letter, and when he asked who she was writing to, she said she was writing to the county commission about the need for a proper water management policy that would prevent individual ranchers from drawing down the creek to levels that affected their neighbors, because the fruit speculation operation upstream had been drawing heavily all summer and contributing to the low levels. He read the draft over her shoulder. It was precise, organized, and devastatingly logical, and it named names without apology. "You know Holt will fight this," he said. "Holt fights everything I bring him," she said. "He has also over the past 4 years been forced to concede 7 of the 9 points I have raised with him because the points were correct. He will fight this one and then concede this one too." Cole pulled up a chair beside her. "What can I help with?" She looked at him, and the look was one he knew well now, the look she wore when something pleased her in a way she had not fully accounted for. "You could sign it with me," she said. "A joint letter from the Hadley operation carries more weight than one from me alone." "Then we will sign it together," he said. They sent the letter. Holt resisted as predicted. The circuit judge received a follow-up correspondence. The policy was adopted in modified form the following spring, and the creek levels in subsequent dry years were measurably better as a result. Maura framed no part of this because she was not the type, but Cole knew she kept the commission's final letter in her desk, and that was sufficient. In the spring of 1882, Maura told him at the kitchen table over morning coffee that they were expecting again. This time the delivery of the news was different, quieter, more confident, without the previous edge of barely concealed fear. She had done this once and knew the shape of it, and knowing the shape of a difficult thing changes your relationship to it. "Are you happy?" he asked, the same question as before. "Very," she said, terrified somewhat less this time, still considerable. "That also seems right," he said. James, who was 2 years old and conducting a thorough investigation of everything within his reach, including the coffee cups, interrupted the moment in the way of 2-year-olds everywhere and always, by requiring immediate and specific attention. "James," Maura said, in the particular tone she used with him, firm and affectionate in equal measure, impossible to mistake for anything other than love. "Please put the cup down." James considered the cup, considered his mother, and put the cup down with the deliberate dignity of someone who has decided to comply on his own terms. Cole watched this negotiation and felt the warmth of it settle through him like good weather. The second child arrived in October, another boy, healthy and vocal, who they named Thomas after no particular person, but because it suited him, with Edward as his middle name after Maura's grandfather, which she had mentioned wanting to honor and which Cole had noted and not forgotten. Thomas looked, from his first moments, entirely like Cole, which Maura found both amusing and slightly alarming. "He has your tendency to be perfectly calm about things that should perhaps be alarming him," she said, the evening after the birth, looking at the baby who was sleeping with placid thoroughness. "Is that a problem?" Cole asked. "It is useful," she conceded, "and deeply at odds with my own approach. He will be interesting." He was. Thomas, from the age he could form opinions, formed them in the quiet, determined way of a person who is not going to announce them loudly, but is not going to change them either, which was so precisely like Cole that Maura often watched their interactions with the affectionate amusement of someone observing herself from outside. James, by contrast, had inherited his mother's directness in a form that arrived daily and sometimes exhaustingly. He had questions about everything, stated conclusions with confidence, and was not particularly bothered by being wrong because he moved quickly to the next question. At 3 years old, he informed Walt Briggs, who had come to visit, that his horse needed her left rear shoe replaced, an assessment that turned out to be correct. "Where does he get that?" Walt asked, slightly awed. "From me," Maura said, without looking up from what she was doing. "Of course," Walt said. "Obviously." The ranch, by 1883, was one of the most productive operations in that part of the hill country. The land Cole had originally owned and the Vance property were managed as a seamless whole, with a bunkhouse that held 2 permanent hands and additional seasonal labor during the drives. The market garden had expanded twice and now supplied 3 establishments in San Antonio on a regular schedule. The horse breeding program that Maura had developed was producing animals that went for prices that surprised even the buyers, because the combination of her understanding of bloodlines and Cole's knowledge of working cattle horses produced a product that was both beautiful and entirely practical. Cole was 33 years old and in better health than he had ever been, which he attributed partly to regular meals and partly to the general physiological effects of sustained happiness. Maura was 29 and formidable in exactly the ways she had always been formidable, with additional dimensions added by the years of marriage and motherhood, and the gradual full opening of a person who has learned that the love around her is not provisional. She was, he thought on a particular morning in the early spring of 1883, standing in the kitchen making biscuits while James attempted to climb the cabinet and Thomas sat on the floor conducting a solemn examination of a wooden horse, exactly what he had recognized at the auction. A woman who was right, and who had always been right about the value of herself, even when the entire town was telling her differently. He stood in the doorway watching her, and she turned and saw him watching and raised an eyebrow. "If you are just going to stand there," she said, "you could at minimum rescue your eldest son from that cabinet." He crossed the kitchen and lifted James down from the cabinet, and set him on his hip and kissed Maura on the temple as he passed her. And she made a sound of acknowledgement that was completely habitual by now, and which he never tired of hearing. That evening, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the dusk, the way they had done hundreds of times, and the evening was warm and the hills were dark against the darkening sky, and the creek could be heard faintly from the north, running well after a good winter. "I have been thinking," Maura said. She was sitting in the rocking chair with her feet up on the porch rail, which she only did when she was fully at rest, which was a circumstance Cole valued and protected whenever possible. "About anything specific?" he asked, the same question as always. "About the auction," she said. "About what would have happened if you had not stood up." He thought about it. "The land would have gone to Crane or Prout. You would have had 30 days to vacate. The surplus after the debt would have sat in escrow." "I would have left," she said. "I had already thought about it. I had a cousin in Austin, vague acquaintance at best, but I had thought about writing to her and asking if she knew of any situation that required a housekeeper or a cook or a teacher, anything." He looked at her profile in the fading light. "You never told me that." "I did not want to seem diminished by it," she said, "by how close it was." "You could never seem diminished by surviving," he said. She looked at him. "I used to think surviving was the whole goal," she said. "I had no practice at anything larger." And now she looked out at the darkening hills. Then she looked at him, and the look she gave him had everything in it. The years of work and the boys asleep inside, and the land running down to the creek and the kitchen with the blue enamel coffee pot, and the shelf of books and the partnership agreement that had become a marriage and the marriage that had become a life. "Now," she said, "I know what larger looks like." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had first taken it on the creek bank in December of that first year, and she wove her fingers through his with the ease of long practice. "I love you," he said, "in case I have not said it recently enough to be useful." "You said it this morning," she said. "And yesterday evening and twice on Thursday. I will try to maintain the frequency." She squeezed his hand. "It is useful," she said. "It is always useful." They sat together while the last light left the sky, and the stars came out over the Texas hills, the same stars that had been there for every moment of the years they had built together. The auction and the thunderstorm and the bluebonnets and the biscuits and the boys and the creek and all of it. Everything he had bet everything he owned on and won, which turned out to be not land or cattle or horses or any of the accounting of property, but this. The specific, irreplaceable daily miracle of a life shared with a person you had chosen and who had chosen you back. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek grew and changed in the way of small Texas towns in the last decades of the 19th century. The railroad finally came through, in 1885, not through the Vance land as Prout had speculated, but close enough that it opened the cattle market considerably, and brought new merchants and a new school, and a physician who replaced the aged doctor who had served the county for decades. Maura had opinions about all of it, and was involved in the formation of the school board and the library committee, and argued successfully with the town council that the new school should be open to all children regardless of race or income, which was not the universal view, and which caused a great deal of controversy, and which she navigated with the combination of logical force and absolute refusal to be moved that had, over the course of her adult life, worn down more resistant systems than this one. Cole supported her in all of this with the particular quality of support that is not passive but active, present at meetings when she needed him there, absent when his presence would distract from the issue at hand, available always as the person she came home to and talked through the day with, and who said with reliable consistency that she was right. "You always say I am right," she said once, with slight exasperation. "You are usually right," he said. "On the occasions when you are not, I say so." "Name one occasion." "The spring planting of 1882, he said immediately. "You wanted to put the north section into corn, and I said it would be too wet that year, and you said you had watched that field for 20 years and you knew its drainage, and it flooded." She was quiet for a moment. "I remember that. "I did not say so to win," he said. "I said so because you asked." "Yes," she said. "That is the infuriating thing about you. You are consistently fair," he smiled. "I will try to be less so." "Do not," she said, and the word had no sharpness in it at all. In 1886 she told him, at the kitchen table over morning coffee, that there was to be a third child. James was 6 and Thomas was 4, and the household was already thoroughly organized around the particular chaos of 2 boys who were as different from each other as the north and south ends of the same pasture. And Cole received this news with the uncomplicated joy of a man who has learned, over 8 years of marriage, to trust that the good things are real. The third baby arrived in the spring of 1887, a daughter this time, the only girl, and from her first moments surrounded by a family that knew exactly how to value a female person with opinions, which turned out to be the most important inheritance anyone could provide. They named her Clara Silas Hadley, the middle name carrying forward the grandfather who had loved the land that had become their life. Maura held Clara the evening of her birth with an expression that was different from the expression she had worn with the boys, not more love, because the love was always the same in its fullness, but differently weighted, as if she were giving this small person something that had taken her own life its full measure of years to receive. "Hello, Clara," she said softly. "You are going to be exactly as difficult as you need to be. I want you to know that from the beginning." Cole, sitting beside her on the bed with the warm lantern light on both of them, thought he might be the luckiest man in Texas, which was a thing he had thought before and which did not become less true with repetition. James looked at his new sister the next morning with the evaluating expression he brought to new information. Thomas sat beside his mother and looked at the baby with the calm acceptance of his nature. "Is she ours?" James asked. "She is," Cole said. "What will she do?" James asked. "Many things," Maura said. "In time." James considered this and appeared satisfied. Thomas reached out and very carefully put one finger against Clara's hand, and Clara, with the reflexive grip of the newborn, held on to it, and Thomas looked up at his parents with an expression of pure quiet wonder. The ranch ran, and the years moved, and the family grew into the shape of itself, the specific shape that this particular combination of people and land and choice and weather and work and love made together, unrepeatable, entire. Cole Hadley was not the richest rancher in the hill country, and he was not the most famous, and the story of the auction was one that people told for a long time in Redemption Creek, usually with the heading that he had bet everything he owned on the woman the town called difficult, which was true, and had won, which was also true, though what he had won was considerably more specific and comprehensive than land. He had won the right to spend his mornings in a kitchen that smelled of biscuits and coffee, listening to Maura tell James why his assessment of the eastern pasture fence was correct and what he should do about it, while Thomas ate his breakfast with the focused satisfaction of someone who is exactly where he wants to be. And Clara watched the world from wherever she had been placed with the dark eyes that were entirely her mother's and entirely her own. He had won the thing that the town, in its various assessments of Maura Vance, had consistently missed, that the difficulty they named in her was simply the shape that her particular excellence took in a world that had not, for most of her life, been ready to accommodate it. That what looked like hardness was the form that softness takes when it has learned to protect itself. That the woman who had argued with a commissioner in the street, who had kept a failing ranch running while her father died, who had read Shakespeare by candlelight and kept meticulous ledgers, and had stood at an auction watching her life being sold out from under her with her chin up. That woman, given one person who intended to stay, had a capacity for love that was as large and as thorough and as unrelenting as everything else about her. He had won her, and she had won him, and they had both won the daily work of a shared life, which was the best prize the wild country of Texas had available, and which, on an ordinary morning in the spring of 1889, still felt like something that was only beginning. Maura was in the garden when he found her that particular morning, the kitchen garden that had grown from the practical plot of a woman, surviving to the extensive and somewhat magnificent enterprise of a woman thriving. Clara, 2 years old and ambulatory with the determined energy of her nature, was attempting to follow a rooster across the garden with a purpose that was unclear. James, 9 years old and the image of his mother in disposition, was conducting a repair on the southeast fence that he had identified as necessary before anyone asked him to. Thomas, 7, was doing what Thomas usually did in free moments, which was sitting in the shade of the live oak reading the almanac with the focused attention his father brought to a good piece of land. Cole stood at the garden gate and watched all of them, and Maura looked up from her work and saw him standing there. "You are going to tell me something," she said. It was not a question. In 11 years of marriage she had learned the specific shape of his expressions. "The buyer from San Antonio sent a letter," he said. "He wants to expand the horse contract, double the number through next year." She straightened up. "Can we manage it? With the north pasture cleared and the additional hands we discussed, yes," he said. "It will be full work." She looked at him, calculating, and then she smiled, the full smile, the one that was still capable of stopping him in his tracks after 11 years. "Then we will manage it," she said. He came through the gate, and she handed him the basket she had been filling, because that was how they worked, the handoff of tasks, the seamless collaboration of two people who had learned each other's strengths and trusted them. He walked beside her through the garden rows while Clara continued her investigation of the rooster situation, and the oak leaves filtered the morning light and the creek spoke faintly from the north. "I have been thinking," she said, "about anything specific. About the fact that it has been 11 years since that auction, and sometimes I forget what it felt like before," she said. "And then I remember and I think how strange that all of this was on the other side of one very expensive and impractical decision. $420, he said. "Everything you owned," she said. "It was," he agreed. She stopped walking and looked at him. The morning was already warm, and she had a smear of garden soil on her cheek, and her hair was coming down on one side, and she was looking at him with those steady dark eyes that had assessed him that first day on Main Street and had been assessing him every day since, and he had never once minded. "Was it worth it?" she asked. It was not a real question. It was the kind of question people ask when they know the answer and want to hear it said. He looked at her at the garden behind her, and the house beyond that, and the children distributed across the morning in their different ways, at the land rolling down to the creek and the hills beyond and the sky above all of it, at the life that was built and building and real. "Every single cent," he said. She took the basket back from him and turned toward the house, and as she passed him she put her free hand briefly to his face, that same gesture, the lightest contact, and then walked on. He stood in the garden for a moment, watching her go, and felt the full weight of what he had won on that summer afternoon in 1878, when the hammer fell and the crowd murmured and a woman with her chin up had turned to look at him and asked, in genuine confusion, why he had done it. He had told her he had not entirely worked it out yet. He had worked it out. He had worked it out in the first evening on her porch, and the thunderstorm in the barn, and the December walk by the creek, and the wedding in May, and the birth of James and Thomas and Clara, and 11,000 mornings at the kitchen table over blue enamel coffee, and the evenings on the porch with the stars coming up over the Texas hills. He had worked it out, and the answer was simple, and it was this: that a life lived alongside someone you love and respect and continue to discover is not a consolation or a luxury or a particular good fortune, but the very substance of what a life is for. That the town of Redemption Creek had called her difficult and had been wrong about the word and wrong about the implication, and that the town could continue its opinions for as long as it liked, because some things are true regardless of the prevailing consensus. That Maura Vance, who became Maura Hadley, who had argued in the street about justice and kept her father's ranch alive, and stood at an auction watching everything end with her chin up. She was worth every dollar he had owned and every dollar he would ever own, and more than that, considerably more, and he had known it from the first moment he watched her fight alone for what was right. He walked back to the house. James was still working on the fence. Thomas was still reading under the oak. Clara had apparently resolved the rooster situation in some manner and was now sitting in the kitchen doorway eating a piece of bread with the satisfaction of someone who has had a productive morning. Inside, Maura was already at the table with the ledger open, planning the expansion, her pen moving across the columns with the organized energy of a woman who had turned surviving into thriving and had brought everyone she loved along with her. Cole sat down across from her. She did not look up, but she reached across the table and pushed his coffee cup toward him. He picked it up and drank, and outside the window the Texas morning was doing what Texas mornings do in the hill country in the spring, laying itself out wide and bright and full of whatever you are willing to put into it. And inside this house there was coffee and children and ledgers and love, and it was all of it, every single impractical, expensive, glorious bit of it, exactly what he had meant to build.